Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Business Line's State of Economy podcast series. Today, we have with us Mr. Manoj Sinha, the founder of HUSK Power Systems. He is among the early pioneers in India, specifically on green energy transition, particularly microgrids, a concept that can ensure uninterrupted power to remote and rural communities. He leads HUSK Power Systems, a global team of 600 professionals spread across the US, Asia, and Africa, delivering affordable, reliable, and clean energy to rural communities through innovative microgrid solutions. Recognized as a Time 100 most influential business leaders in climate and a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, Manoj holds an MBA from the University of Virginia Darden School of Business and MS in Electrical and Computer Engineering from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a BTech in Electronics Engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology, PHU. HUSK Power Systems installed the first microgrid in Bihar way back in 2008, which was based on a biomass gasification system. As many of us would know, microgrids are considered a viable solution to address energy poverty. Such decentralized electricity generating systems can enhance access to electricity in rural and remote parts of India. So while the expansion of the main grid has significantly improved our access to power and electricity, microgrids can play a very important role in improving reliability, particularly in rural areas. So here, with his deep understanding, his work in the last over a decade on such initiatives can help us understand what is the significance of such energy system. Welcome, Manoj, to the Business Line State of Economy podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Manoj, without wasting much time, I'll begin with the question answers. If you could break down for our listeners, what are microgrids?
So microgrids, or interchangeably called mini-grids in the global south, is a concept of decentralized electricity generation and distribution using mostly renewable assets. In HUSK case, what we define as a mini-grid or a microgrid is a small power plant system that might be 50 kilowatt all the way up to 1 megawatt capacity, which consists of, from power generation perspective, solar PV for daytime supply. In our case, we use biomass gasification for evening time supply and battery bank so that we can deliver 24/7 uninterrupted power no matter what type of weather, etc., is out there. Then we also lay out a distribution network, which is a low voltage distribution network up to a distance of, let's say, 3 kilometers to 4 kilometers in radius, and provide a connection or electricity to customers in that footprint, which consists of residential customers, MSMEs to a large extent for India market, and small factories. For Nigeria, it's exactly the same concept. The difference will be on customer segment, which might be much more residential customers in Nigeria rural market than India. So that's what a mini grid is. And currently we have installed 300 plus mini grids across these two countries, India and Nigeria. And we're expanding at a rate of about 25 mini grids or new mini grids on a monthly basis. Hope that answers your question.
It does, in a sense. So Manoj, you're well aware of the strides India has made in ramping up its power infrastructure, whether it's transmission, whether it's producing generation. Where does mini grids fit in this whole system? How can India leverage mini grids? As you are aware, as more renewable energy is being produced, it is also leading to some operational issues like need to balance the grid. So in this whole Indian power infrastructure, how can mini grids play a critical role?
That's a great question, Rishi, and you hit some of the points like right on the money. So in Indian context, India has done a phenomenal job of expanding the grid presence across every nook and cranny that did not even have electricity grid back even in 2010. So that's the good news. Not so good news is that electricity reliability and quality of electricity and customer services are practically absent when it comes to rural parts of at least a few states that we operate in, and that includes Bihar, UP, Jharkhand, and the rest. So how do you really fill the gap of lack of electricity or reliable electricity in these areas when there is a grid presence, but it is not reliable enough, or the quality of electricity is not good enough for MSME and factory customers? That's where minigrid plays a critical role in solving two critical issues for customers. One is just lack of reliable electricity, and second is quality, right? So if you have to run a machine, let's say a lathe machine in a factory, or some other machines that you might be operating as an agro processing masala chakki, for example, you have to have a certain voltage profile that doesn't fluctuate and a frequency that doesn't fluctuate. That's what minigrid is able to deliver: very high quality service in terms of electricity, voltage, and frequency, as well as customer service. So if, for example, if a customer has some problem in accessing our electricity, we have a promise or a service level agreement with these customers that we will fix the problem under 90 minutes. And that's what we are able to deliver. That means these MSMEs and factories are not suffering for a loss of revenue and such that unreliable grid today has. Right. So that is going down into the actual customer pain points that we are solving that the grid is not able to. Now, if we elevate ourselves at India level, let's say we take a 30,000 feet view of India, and India's target is to get to net zero by 2070, which I think is not aggressive enough, by the way. So, how do we really get, what is the journey that will take us from where we stand, which is roughly 68, 69% fossil fuel on our grid, to a net zero space? Just bringing more intermittent renewable energy on the grid is not the answer, right? So we are close to 30% of our total power requirement is delivered by intermittent renewable assets. That includes solar farms, that includes wind power, and so on and so forth. But as more of these intermittent power sources gets added on the grid inherently becomes unstable, right? Which you were referring to in your question as grid balancing. That's where these decentralized assets that we have built and are building, and as I explained, these mini grids or microgrids have battery bank as one of the storage that supplies 24/7 power. The grid will become more stable, and the grid will allow more intermittent sources to come online by only adding these decentralized resources that we have built that have battery bank as one of the elements that will actually act as a shock absorber to stabilize the grid in a decentralized and a more economical fashion. That is the only path that India can take to get to a reliable net zero by 2070. Obviously, it also requires more technology innovation. One of the things that I have been talking about recently is a virtual power plant concept, which is, in a simple term, it is artificial intelligence powered framework or a platform that handles all these large utilities injecting power, let's say, 1 gigawatt solar farm injecting power to the grid, but also managing these decentralized resources in an algorithmic manner so that overarching grid becomes stable at every given moment of the day. Right? That's the innovation that India doesn't have today and is required for India to have a successful journey to net zero. So I'll stop there, but that's how I think this
No,
problem needs to be.
that's a great breakdown. So the second, a supplementary question to it would be that you would be aware that Indian government has a initiative for rural solar called PM Kusum. Now the
Yes.
government has been trying to make Indian agriculture diesel free. And
Mhm.
now the push is that farmers should be using solar in the day and they should stop using the using power in the night, so that solar could come in and fill in those gaps. Now
Right.
PM Kusum has had several issues. Its offtake has been not as expected.
Right.
Microgrids, and I'm aware. So, if, for instance, in a field the amount of capacity of solar panels that you can put is limited. So, for a discom to have a line for every farmer's field to buy that solar power is not economically viable. So, Maharashtra, I think, is trying to experiment with an aggregate load. So, they're
Yes.
creating a 1 megawatt. So, in such a scenario, where can microgrids come in? Because I think this could be a solution to, where we can, fast track PM Kusum's initiatives. Do you think this would be possible?
Absolutely. You are again, I'm actually very pleasantly surprised that you have a lot of information on this that many folks that I speak to in India don't. So thank you for bringing these points. Yes, PM Kusum has had only a certain amount of success, and the reasons are varied. One is obviously it is for irrigating, and sometimes you do need to irrigate the land at night time, so you have less evaporation of water. And two, while PM Kusum has been built, PM Kusum scheme, if you look at, is actually an isolated microgrid, right? You do 5 to 7 kilowatt of solar panel connected to an irrigation pump that pumps out water and irrigates the field. So essentially, it is single customer microgrid or mini grid that is spread across India. And we also, by the way, actively roll out these solar pumps with partners, and we are participant in PM Kusum scheme. What is lacking in India today is a policy that interconnects all these isolated mini grids, microgrids, solar irrigation pumps, and combines it together to the central grid, right? So the interconnection of these assets or the policy to promote that is completely missing. That is what I was alluding to as a virtual power plant to stabilize the grid is only possible when there is a policy that makes these interconnections possible. And India doesn't have that today, not to my knowledge at least. Maharashtra has taken a wonderful initiative of installing, let's say, 1 to 2 megawatt solar farm near a substation. So downstream, it can supply the required energy need of farming community through that power that can be evacuated locally because locally the grid is not that unstable and can serve the needs of the farmers at least during daytime. So I think it will succeed. The policy is falling behind, and the policy is where Indian government at both CERC and different state ERC needs to step up to promote integration of these isolated mini grids onto the grid, at least at the substation level. Because then you are right on the money when you say the farmers need to transition to renewable energy so that India does become net zero. And as you might know, the whole agriculture value chain, from irrigation to harvesting to processing to transporting it to the table if we are eating that, emits 25% of global GHG emissions. So it is absolutely important to solve that systematically. And the policy on interconnection would be the very first step that will make it happen. And the technology that I was alluding to, which is artificial intelligence powered virtual power plant, will make it possible to scale across India. Last point I want to make is we are actually piloting this type of intervention in Nigeria market where we are present. We have partnered with Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria, and we are going to roll out 250 megawatts worth of these types of decentralized assets that will be integrated with the main grid using a virtual power plant technology that I was just speaking about.
So, Manoj, before I ask you about your experiences in India, just one supplementary question to this. When we talk about artificial intelligence and AI automated solutions, they consume considerable amount of power. As we are seeing what is happening in data centers in the United States, as more AI processing is in. With respect to India, do you think the growing incidence of AI and the more requirement power by data centers, are we on the right track, or is it we need to do something more to to balance those requirements?
Right. So it's a great question. And actually, I'm part of ethical discussions on AI in the United States, where I'm usually based out of. If you do a simple Google search, let's say it takes, I don't know, 1 kilojoules of energy to do a simple text search on Google. If you do that same search on an AI platform or use Google Gemini to ask the same question, it takes 20 to 30 times more energy, right? Because it processes algorithm in the background. So yes, I don't think for a simple search, you know, you need to go and ask Chat GPT that question. You can just do a simple Google search, and that's more energy efficient route. So that's the ethical side of balancing growth with actual need that we might have in terms of solution. For the virtual power plant concept that I'm talking about that will use artificial intelligence is actually the low cost, or I would say most capital efficient way to make sure that India, or for that matter any country in the world, will have to go through to meet their net zero goals if they have stated one. And there is no alternate route in terms of a more capital efficient way of reaching there, right? And we are an emerging economy. We need to make sure that our capital is at India level is spent well and more efficiently. And that's the only route that I can see India taking to reach its goal. The other route for India could be to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to double, triple the strength of the central grid. That can also address this problem, but that is much more expensive and money not well spent.
That's actually a great explanation. Manoj, now coming to your experience in India, I mean, you set up the first microgrid in Bihar in 2008, and 2008, this time was quite a changing time for Bihar. I think the second term of Mr. Nitish Kumar were there. NTPC Bar project was coming up. Bihar was going full throttle on roads, and there was a development paradigm that was being discussed. Uh, I was a journalist then, and there were quite a few entrepreneurs who had returned to Bihar to launch their initiatives. And it's during that time, and I think 2008 is also the time when I think Mr. Narendra Modi was the Gujarat chief minister, and he first time I think bought solar power at 16 rupees per unit. It is that context where I think HUSK Power also. So could you take us to the journey? What were the challenges then, and perhaps you would be one of the best people to give us a differentiated look on what are we doing good, better right now, and which I think we were not doing in 2008, or what we are doing better in 2024 in the terms of change in the outlook of the government towards energy transition, climate change, ecological balancing. If you could take us to that journey.
Right. So, 2008, when we were installing the first power plant, interestingly, in Tamkuha area of Bihar. I'm from Bihar. I was born and brought up in Bihar. It was interesting because that area was considered kidnapping capital of my state. So it was a little scary, but nonetheless, like you mentioned, India and my state was going through a transition period in a good way. And to give you a very quick answer, from 2008 to 2024, it's a dramatic change in the positive direction, even in those rural and remote areas that I have witnessed with my own two eyes. So what I was alluding to is from a bird's eye viewpoint, and I have witnessed the change in India and my home state Bihar between 2008 and 2024. It's a dramatic and exponential change in the positive direction, fueled a lot by both central government and state governments. There's a palpable economic status change of people in these rural and remote areas. Concretely speaking, like I was saying, this Tamkuha area where we installed the plant, wherein I literally had to pitch a tent because there was no hotel in 10, 20-kilometer radius, and stayed in a tent to build our very first mini grid actually for 4 to 5 weeks. And I had to build the first actually toilet to make sure that I don't defecate outside. Long story short, that was India in 2008 or Bihar in 2008. Fast forward with all the policy interventions and things that happened. Now there are grid presence everywhere. Economic development is showing in terms of roads and things of that nature. So it's all very positive, but we could have done a lot better over these last 16 years. And yes, there has been policies that, for example, the mini grids policy did not exist when we installed our first mini grid. The UP was the first state to roll out mini grids policy because I was able to have a conversation with then UPERC chairman, Mr. Verma, and he understood what we are discussing actually today. He was more of a visionary IAS officer, and now he is retired. And UP launched its first mini grid policy in 2016 summer, I believe, and then other states like Bihar and others followed. Right, so there has been a positive momentum across the board. Climate change was not the issue that we were trying to solve. We were really trying to solve the issue of lack of reliable electricity, which is the basic fuel that drives an economy, right? GDP per capita is directly correlated with energy per capita or energy consumption per capita. And Bihar and UP are far, far below the national average. And national average itself is not great. So those progress have happened. When we crafted this mini grid solution, we wanted to do it incorporating the climate change that was going, that was sort of picking up momentum. That's why we did 100% renewable energy with our mini grids. And a last point I want to make on this topic is we are seeing the adverse impact of climate change today, right? So the areas that we serve, we right now have 300 mini grids across these two states. The flooding events back in 2008 and 9 used to be like once every 3-4 years. The flooding event right now is once every year at least, sometimes twice in the same year. So there's a disproportionately adverse impacting event that impacts these farming community and others every single year now that must be addressed by intervention that will systematically reduce the fossil fuel dependence that India grid today has on thermal and others.
That's a great observation. One last question, Manoj. How do you look at India's energy transition right now? We are moving. I think we are moving sort of in the right direction. But do you think we lack something? If there is something which we lack, what would that be? Or how could we can have a sustainable and a sustainable transition?
So India has done really well under the current government regime, and it was also present in the last two previous 5 years in terms of pushing India's envelope on solar and wind. Right, we went from practically 0 gigawatt in let's say early 2000s to now more than 40 gigawatts of these energies or renewable energies assets that with good policy and other things promoted. But what I think is that is not sufficient and that is not enough for India to transition to net zero that we have set out as a country by 2070. What is needed is a systematic policy drive that will systematically reduce the fossil fuel dependence of the grid, which remains stubbornly at close to 65 to 70%. And this whole agri value chain that we just discussed, which is 25% contributor to the emissions. And solving these must include decentralized energy resources that are interconnected with the central grid. And that can only happen with policies that do not exist today. And this policy will actually spur more technology innovation on the AI and virtual power, as well as bring in more private capital. And we need hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to be able to get there. Right. So this budget talked about climate taxonomy, and India is just trying to figure out, which is great. Climate adaptation is absolutely needed, and it was needed actually yesterday, not even tomorrow. Right. And climate adaptation is not just climate transition. Climate adaptation is what I was alluding to as flooding event that is happening every year. Why would or why should these people pay a higher price of lost economic activity and things like that? There has to be a funding to have a better design, new design that will actually curtail all these floodings that happens. At COP28, we talked about, I was there, we talked about climate adaptation funding. A lot of money were committed to that. India needs to drive it and actually implement it in India for us to have a just energy transition and a systematic way to getting to net zero by 2070.
Thank you, Manoj, for joining our State of the Economy podcast and enriching it with your practical experience on climate change and electricity in the last 16 years.
Thank you very much for having me. You had wonderful questions, so thanks a lot.